Picture this. It's May 21st, 1940, near the French town of Arras. German 7th Panzer Division is rolling through France like an unstoppable tide, crushing everything in its path. Then, out of nowhere, British tanks appear. Not the flimsy tin cans the Germans expected. These things are different. German anti-tank crews line up their sights, pull their triggers, and watch in disbelief as their shells just bounce off. Ping, 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 like throwing pebbles at a castle wall. Meanwhile, the British tanks keep coming, methodically destroying everything in front of them. German infantry are scrambling, officers are shouting, and one man, Rommel himself, is frantically organizing anything that can possibly stop these armored monsters. This is the story of the Matilda II, Britain's walking fortress, a tank so heavily armored it made the Wehrmacht question their life choices. The Matilda II didn't just appear out of thin air. Its story begins in the mid-1930s when the British military was trying to figure out what kind of tanks they actually needed for the next war. They were still haunted by memories of World War I where breakthrough was everything. The solution they came up with was to split their armored forces into two categories: fast cruiser tanks for exploitation and mobile warfare, and slow, heavily armored infantry tanks designed to support foot soldiers in grinding through defensive positions. Think of it like choosing between a sports car and an armored truck. Both have their uses, but you wouldn't want to confuse them. In 1936, the War Office issued specification A-12 for a new infantry tank. They wanted something that could absorb punishment while supporting infantry attacks at walking pace. The design work fell to the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich, and they had some interesting inspiration to work with. They borrowed heavily from an experimental tank called the A-7 medium tank from the early 1930s. From the A-7, they took the suspension system, the drivetrain layout, and even some armor design concepts. But they cranked everything up to 11. Where the A-7 had been lightly protected, the new A-12 would be an absolute unit. By April 1938, the first prototype rolled out for testing. It was nicknamed Matilda II, or Matilda Senior, to distinguish it from the earlier infantry tank Mk.I, which was also called Matilda, but was basically a machine gun carrier with delusions of grandeur. The original Matilda only had 2 crew members and a single machine gun. It was painfully slow at 8 miles per hour and had exposed running gear. It was frankly terrible. The Matilda II, on the other hand, was a completely different beast. It weighed in at 27 tons, carried 4 crew members, and mounted an actual anti-tank gun, the QF 2-pounder 40mm cannon. But the real star of the show was the armor. Let's talk about that armor because this is what made the Matilda II legendary. The frontal armor was a staggering 78mm thick. To put that in perspective, German Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs from the same era had 30 to 50 millimeters of frontal armor. The Matilda II had nearly twice as much. The turret was cast in a single piece of hardened steel, cylindrical and tall, with 75 millimeters of armor all around. The sides had 65 to 70 millimeters. Even the rear had 55 millimeters protecting the engine compartment. This thing was an absolute fortress. In 1938 and 1939, there simply wasn't an anti-tank gun in the world that could reliably penetrate it from the front. The armor was so thick that crews could take direct hits from enemy anti-tank guns and not even notice except for the clang of metal on metal. But that armor came at a cost, a massive cost. The Matilda II was powered by 2 AEC straight-6 diesel engines, basically bus engines, each producing 87 horsepower. These 2 engines were mounted side by side in the rear of the hull, connected to a common drive shaft. On paper, this gave the tank 174 horsepower. In reality, it meant the Matilda II was slow, really slow. Top speed on roads was 16 miles per hour. Cross-country, especially in rough terrain or desert sand, it often crawled along at just 6 miles per hour. You could literally run faster than this tank could drive. The twin-engine setup was also a maintenance nightmare. Mechanics had to work on each engine separately, and if one failed, the whole tank was compromised. The steering mechanism was troublesome, especially in harsh conditions, but in 1939, when Britain was preparing for war, speed wasn't seen as a problem. Infantry tanks were supposed to move at the pace of walking soldiers. That was the whole point. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain had exactly 2 Matilda IIs in service. 2. The production lines were just starting to ramp up. By May 1940, when Germany launched its devastating blitzkrieg through France and the Low Countries, the British Expeditionary Force in France had received more Matildas, but still not many. The 7th Royal Tank Regiment had 23 Matilda IIs. The 4th Royal Tank Regiment had none. They were still equipped with the inferior Matilda I's, basically glorified machine gun carriers, so when the Germans smashed through the Ardennes forest and raced toward the English Channel, threatening to cut off the entire Allied army, the British had very few of these wonder tanks to work with. This brings us back to Arras on May 21, 1940. The British and French forces were being systematically destroyed by the German blitzkrieg. Panzer divisions were racing westward, leaving chaos in their wake. British commanders decided to launch a counterattack, hoping to cut through the German lines and slow down the advance. The plan was ambitious, but the forces available were limited. The attacking force consisted of about 2,000 men and 74 tanks. Of those 74 tanks, 58 were the pathetic Matilda I's with machine guns only. Just 16 were the heavily armored Matilda IIs with actual anti-tank guns. That's it, 16 Matilda IIs and 58. Machine gun carriers against Rommel's 7th Panzer Division and elements of the Totenkopf SS Division. The attack went forward in 2 columns. The left column advanced through several French villages, pushing aside German infantry. The right column headed for other objectives, and then the fireworks started. German anti-tank crews, equipped with the standard 37mm Mk./36 anti-tank gun, opened fire. These guns had proven effective against Polish and French tanks. They should have torn the Matildas apart. Instead, the shells just bounced off. One Matilda took 14 direct hits from 37mm guns and kept fighting. The German gunners were horrified. They called the Mk./36 the door knocker because that's all it could do against heavy armor. Knock on the door and hope someone answered. The Matilda IIs plowed through German positions like they owned the place. They crushed anti-tank guns under their tracks. They blasted German vehicles with their 2-pounder guns. German infantry threw hand grenades at them, which did absolutely nothing except make noise. Some SS troops actually ran at the Matildas, trying to disable them with grenades. A brave but completely suicidal tactic. The British tanks kept coming, grinding forward, destroying everything in their path. For a few hours, it looked like the British might actually pull off a miracle. But then Rommel got involved. Erwin Rommel, commanding the 7th Panzer Division, quickly realized his standard weapons were useless. So he improvised. He rounded up every heavy gun he could find and organized them into a gun line. This included 105mm field howitzers, normally used for indirect fire, now aimed horizontally at tanks. And crucially, he deployed 88mm anti-aircraft guns. The Flak 88, as it was known, was designed to shoot down bombers at high altitude. It fired a massive shell at extremely high velocity. Rommel ordered them turned on the Matildas, and it worked. The 88mm guns could penetrate the Matilda II's frontal armor at ranges up to 2,000 yards, twice the effective range of the British 2-pounder. German crews watched through their sights as their shells finally smashed through that legendary armor. Matildas began to burn. One by one, they were knocked out. By the end of the day, the British had lost 30 tanks, and the counterattack had failed. But here's the thing, even though the attack failed tactically, it succeeded strategically in ways the British couldn't have imagined. The Germans were shaken. Reports coming back to German high command spoke of heavy British tanks that seemed invincible. Adolf Hitler himself had a crisis of nerves. The Wehrmacht had been racing westward at breakneck speed, confident in their superiority. Now they were suddenly cautious. The German advance slowed down just enough to allow more Allied troops to escape to Dunkirk. Historians argue that if the Germans had kept up their pace, the evacuation at Dunkirk might have been impossible. The fine, Matilda II, even in tiny numbers, had bought precious time. All the surviving Matildas were abandoned when the British evacuated from Dunkirk and France fell. But the legend of the Matilda II was just getting started. Because the tank's finest hour wasn't in France, it was in North Africa. In September 1940, Italy declared war on Britain and invaded Egypt from Libya. The Italian commander, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, advanced into Egypt with overwhelming numerical superiority. He had about 250,000 troops, hundreds of guns, and 125 tanks. The British Western Desert Force under Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor had just 36,000 men. But O'Connor had something special. He had received reinforcements that included a full battalion of Matilda IIs equipped and trained specifically for desert warfare. This was the 7th Royal Tank Regiment, reborn after France, now fully equipped with the infantry tanks. O'Connor planned a limited offensive called Operation Compass, originally intended as a 5-day raid to push the Italians back. It kicked off on December 9, 1940. The Matildas were assigned to support the infantry in attacking Italian fortified camps. What happened next was one of the most lopsided victories of the entire war. The Italian forces in North Africa were equipped primarily with L3 tankettes, which were basically armored golf carts with machine guns, and M1139 medium tanks with hull-mounted 37mm guns. These vehicles couldn't penetrate the Matilda II's armor at any range, and their own armor was laughably thin. Italian anti-tank guns were similarly useless. Italian field artillery, normally effective against infantry, did nothing to the Matildas except make loud noises. Italian soldiers watched in horror as British tanks rolled over their positions, crushing guns, destroying vehicles, and casually shrugging off every weapon thrown at them. An Italian army doctor who witnessed the Matildas in action called them the nearest thing to hell I ever saw. The psychological effect was devastating. Italian troops, already demoralized by poor logistics and questionable leadership, began surrendering en masse. At Sidi Barrani, the first major engagement, the Italians lost 38,300 prisoners. The British lost fewer than 150 men killed. The Matildas earned a new nickname, Queen of the Desert. O'Connor didn't stop. Emboldened by success, he pushed westward into Libya. The next target was Bardia, a heavily fortified Italian port. On January 3, 1941, the Australian 6th Division attacked, supported by 23 Matilda IIs of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment. The attack was a textbook example of combined arms warfare. Engineers blew gaps in barbed wire with Bangalore torpedoes. They filled in anti-tank ditches with picks and shovels. Then the infantry and Matildas charged through. The Italian defenders fired everything they had to no effect. The Matildas ground through defensive positions, knocked out bunkers, and destroyed Italian tanks before they could even get into the fight. Bardia fell on January 5th, yielding 36,000 more Italian prisoners, 236 guns, and 73 tanks. Next came Tobruk, another major port. The attack on January 21, 1941 followed the same pattern. Artillery bombardment, air support, naval gunfire, and then the Matildas rolled in with the infantry. The Italian garrison surrendered the next day, giving up 30,000 more prisoners, 200 guns, and 70 tanks. The British advance continued relentlessly. By early February 1941, the Western Desert Force had driven the Italian 10th Army out of Cyrenaica completely. In about 10 weeks, O'Connor's forces advanced 500 miles and captured 130,000 Italian and colonial troops, 400 tanks, and 1,290 artillery pieces. British casualties were 494 killed and 1,225 wounded. This wasn't a battle. It was a massacre, and the Matilda II was the star of the show. Italian weapons simply could not deal with its armor. Italian morale collapsed in the face of what seemed like invincible British supertanks. But then, everything changed. Adolf Hitler, watching his Italian allies get humiliated, decided to intervene. In February 1941, he sent a small expeditionary force to North Africa under a relatively unknown general named Erwin Rommel. Remember him from Arras? Rommel arrived in Libya with the 5th Light Division and later the 15th Panzer Division, forming what would become the famous Afrika Korps. And Rommel remembered the lessons from France. He knew exactly how to deal with Matildas. The 88mm gun. Rommel's arrival changed the entire character of the North African campaign. The Germans brought better tanks, better anti-tank guns, better tactics, and, crucially, those dreaded 88mm flak guns. Rommel's forces quickly went on the offensive, pushing the British back across Libya. During Operation Battle Axe in June 1941, the British tried to break through German positions and relieve the besieged port of Tobruk. They committed large numbers of Matilda IIs, confident in their armor, but Rommel was ready. He had positioned 88mm guns in concealed positions, creating kill zones. British tanks rolled into these ambushes and were systematically destroyed. In Operation Battle Axe alone, the British lost 64 Matilda IIs. The Queen of the Desert had met her executioner. The 88mm guns could knock out Matildas at ranges of 2,000 yards or more, far beyond the effective range of the British 2-pounder gun. German tactics evolved. They would use lighter tanks to draw British armor forward, then withdraw, luring the Matildas into range of concealed 88s. The slow speed of the Matilda, once acceptable for infantry support, now became a fatal weakness. The tanks couldn't maneuver quickly to avoid fire. They couldn't retreat if things went wrong. They were sitting ducks. The arrival of more powerful German anti-tank guns made things worse. The 50mm Pak-38 and later the 75mm Pak-40 gave German infantry units the ability to engage Matildas at combat ranges. By 1942, the Matilda II was increasingly vulnerable. German firing tests showed that even the thick frontal armor could be penetrated by these newer weapons at typical engagement distances. The Matilda was obsolete. Another critical weakness became glaringly obvious in desert warfare. The Matilda II lacked high explosive ammunition for its 2-pounder gun. It only carried armor-piercing solid shot. This meant it was almost useless against dug-in infantry positions or anti-tank guns. All it had was a coaxial machine gun, which wasn't enough. British tanks would face entrenched German positions and be unable to effectively suppress them. Meanwhile, the Germans would wait for the Matildas to get close, then blow them apart with 88s. The twin-engine setup that powered the Matilda also proved problematic in the desert. The engines overheated frequently in the brutal North African heat. Sand got into everything, clogging filters and causing mechanical failures. The troublesome steering mechanism, already an issue, became worse in sandy terrain. Maintenance crews struggled to keep the tanks operational, and the Matilda was expensive to produce. Each one required complex armor castings that were difficult and time-consuming to manufacture. Meanwhile, the Germans and Americans were pumping out simpler, cheaper tanks in larger numbers. By mid-1942, the British Army was phasing out the Matilda II from frontline service in North Africa. It made its last major combat appearance at the First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942. After that, remaining Matildas were used in specialized roles. Some were converted into mine-clearing vehicles called Scorpions, fitted with rotating flail chains to detonate mines ahead of advancing troops. These saw action at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. Others were converted into canal defense light tanks, with turrets replaced by massive searchlights for night operations. A few became artillery observation posts or command vehicles. But as gun tanks, as fighting vehicles meant to destroy enemy armor, the Matilda II was finished in North Africa. However, the story doesn't end there. Over 1,000 Matilda IIs were sent to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. The Soviets appreciated the heavy armor, though they complained about the weak gun. Some Soviet Matildas were even fitted with captured German 76mm guns to increase their firepower. They served on the Eastern Front throughout the war, mostly in infantry support roles. The heavy armor made them effective against German anti-tank guns from the early war period, though by 1943 and 1944 they were as obsolete in Russia as they were in Africa. The most extensive late-war use of Matilda IIs was by Australian forces in the Pacific Theater. Between 1942 and 1944, Australia received 409 Matilda IIs, plus 33 close support versions transferred from New Zealand. The Australian 4th Armoured Brigade used them extensively against Japanese forces in New Guinea, Bougainville, and Borneo. Against Japanese tanks, which were lightly armored and equipped with small-caliber guns, the Matilda was once again nearly invincible. Japanese Type 95. Heigo light tanks and Type 97 Chiha medium tanks couldn't penetrate the Matilda's armor, while the British 2-pounder gun could destroy them easily. The Matilda served Australia well in jungle warfare, supporting infantry and grinding advances through dense terrain. Its slow speed, a liability in the desert, was less of an issue in thick jungle. The Matildas soldiered on in the Pacific until the Japanese surrender in August 1945. So what do we make of the Matilda II? For about 2 years, from 1940 to 1942, it was one of the most formidable tanks in the world. Its armor protection was unmatched. At Arras, it shocked the Germans and contributed to the successful evacuation at Dunkirk. In North Africa, it dominated Italian forces so completely that it earned legendary status. British tankers loved it. Australian crews praised its reliability and protection. But by 1942, the tank war had evolved beyond the Matilda's capabilities. Anti-tank guns got bigger. Enemy tanks got better. The Matilda couldn't keep up. Its small turret ring made it impossible to fit a larger gun. The twin-engine design was maintenance-intensive and unreliable. The slow speed was a death sentence in mobile warfare, and it was expensive to produce compared to alternatives like the Valentine or Churchill tanks. Production of the Matilda II ended in August 1943. Nearly 3,000 were built in total. The tank never achieved the mass production numbers of German Panzers or American Shermans, but its impact on the war was disproportionate to its numbers. It saved lives at Dunkirk. It crushed Italian forces in North Africa, allowing Britain to hold Egypt and the Suez Canal. It bought time for newer, better Allied tanks to be developed and deployed. And it taught the Germans valuable lessons about anti-tank warfare, lessons that influenced their tactics for the rest of the war. Today, surviving Matilda IIs can be found in museums around the world. The Bovington Tank Museum in the UK has one. The Australian War Memorial in Canberra displays one. The Musée des Blindes in France preserves a Matilda named Defiance. These tanks stand as reminders of a specific moment in military history when armor was king and speed was optional. The Matilda II was designed for a type of warfare that was already obsolete by the time it entered service. Slow, methodical infantry support in static battles. But for a brief, shining moment, in France in 1940 and North Africa in 1941, it was exactly the right tool for the job. A walking fortress that made German anti-tank crews question their career choices, caused Italian soldiers to surrender en masse, and earned a legendary reputation that still echoes today. The Matilda II reminds us that in warfare there's no such thing as a perfect weapon. Everything is a trade-off. The Matilda traded. Speed for armor, mobility for protection. In 1940 and 1941, that trade-off worked. In 1942 and beyond, it didn't. But for those crucial years, this slow, chunky, nearly unkillable tank was Britain's answer to the German blitzkrieg. It couldn't stop the Wehrmacht, but it could slow them down, absorb their fire, and hit back with calm, methodical confidence. The walking fortress, the queen of the desert, the Matilda II. For a moment in time, it was legendary. Thank you for watching until the end. You can click in these other videos if you like this one. Don't forget to like and subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified when we upload a new video. Have a good day.